Welcome to Ask the Church, our video series where we seek to answer your questions about church worship, practice, or theology in under 5 minutes. Today's question is about suffering, and it's a very specific question. It's built on the premise that the Christian life is a life of suffering, that it includes suffering. But the question very specifically is, if an honest view of the Christian life involves suffering with Christ, at what point do we tell people that when we're trying to encourage them to follow Christ? Wouldn't that dissuade people from following Jesus if we say the Christian life is a life of suffering? It's a great question, and I think it's worth answering. Just to sort of buttress that premise, the Christian life is a life of suffering because we are joined to Jesus. And he is one who is actually vilified and hated by the world. And so it's not uncommon for Christians to experience that same vilification and hatred. In fact, the Bible tells us to expect it. Jesus says to his disciples at the Last Supper that they've hated me, therefore they'll hate you. And 1 Peter calls us exiles, people who just don't fit in the world. I think about Romans 8, this is verse 16 and 17, where Paul says, the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him, in order that we may also be glorified with him. I think that verse captures an awful lot of theology in very few words. The picture of the Christian life is a picture of movement to glory. It's movement to resurrection. It's movement into the presence of God where healing, where glory, where beauty, where love abound. But the path there is a path that oftentimes goes through the grave. In fact, we could say because of the pattern of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, the path into that glory necessarily goes through the grave. It necessarily involves suffering. And sometimes that's at the hands of people who are hostile to the faith in the world. Sometimes that's at the hands of just sort of the inanimate forces of the brokenness of the world, sicknesses and diseases, things that hurt and afflict and harm. Suffering as a means of moving into glory is woven into the fabric of the Christian life because it is woven into the life of Christ. So wouldn't that dissuade someone from following Jesus if you say, look, the Christian life is a path of glory, but it goes through the grave to get there. It goes through suffering to get there. My basic response to the question is that we should be honest. It doesn't do anybody any good to say, follow Jesus and he'll make everything wonderful and everything will work out in your life. The sort of health and wealth gospel kind of approach. It's not honest to the human experience, and it won't come true. And people they'll feel that they're lied to as soon as they experience deep suffering. In other words, the way that we present the gospel needs to be honest. The way that we present the gospel also needs to be hopeful. The beauty of the Christian message, and there's many beauties of it, but one of the beauties in regards to suffering is that suffering is not the final word. The Christian message assumes that hope does not disappoint. That's Paul's language in Romans 5. That if we are joined to Jesus, even if there are periods of darkness, glory and life and healing are coming. And so there's hope even in that honesty. But the main answer that I want to give is that suffering is actually not unique to Christians. The world is fallen and broken. People experience suffering whether they follow Jesus or not. And acknowledging the reality of what the Bible says about suffering that is part and parcel with the Christian life is a means of actually telling people who are outside the faith that their suffering doesn't have to be empty. Without Christ, the suffering we experience is just that. It's suffering, and there is no answer to it, there's no reason for it, and there's nothing that comes out of it. But joined to Jesus, the suffering that we experience becomes a part of his sufferings. That's what he says to Paul. When Paul is persecuting the church, the man we knew at that moment as Saul, he says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? The suffering of the church is Jesus' own suffering. Our sufferings are joined to him. And if they're joined to his sufferings, then they suddenly become a part of the way that he is redeeming the world. The way that he is bringing about glory in the lives of others, glory in our own lives. In other words, without Christ, suffering is emptiness. It's meaningless. It's just pain. But joined to Jesus, the very pain and suffering that we experience in life suddenly becomes a means of God's glory entering into the world and transforming it. It becomes something it could never be on our own merits when it's joined to Jesus' suffering. In other words, this honesty that the Christian life is a life of suffering and involves suffering, this hopefulness that that's not the final word. It's not only suffering, it actually leads through suffering to glory. It leads through it to the presence of God, but also this profound beauty that our suffering is actually made a part of Christ's suffering, and therefore it has value far beyond what we deserve. When we present the gospel to people, we should be honest, but we should be hopeful. But we should also recognize that in that moment, if we're presenting the fullness of the faith, that following Jesus sometimes means being in exile in this world, that's actually part and parcel with how God brings redemption and glory, because that's Jesus' story and we are joined to him. Hope that this answer helps. There's so much more that could be said about suffering. I think one of the basic truths that I would point to is that suffering is universal. And yet the Bible is the only place where we truly find an answer to it, what to do with it, because God steps into it for us. Jesus suffers on our behalf, and suddenly it's no longer an answerless problem. Hope that helps. As always, thanks for watching this edition of Ask the Church. If you have other questions, send them to Stephen@incarnationrichmond.org. And now go in the grace of God.